It's great to see everybody. Welcome. I'm Amanda Anderson. I'm the director of the Kogan Institute, and I am delighted to welcome David Kurnick to deliver the Sarah Cutts Freerichs Lecture, which is intended to showcase scholars working in the 19th century to give public lectures of broad import. David is, to my mind, one of the most interesting critics working today, particularly in his ability to balance attentive, close reading with deep theoretical insights grounded in intellectual and literary history. While I do think of him as a fellow scholar of the 19th century novel, like many of the most influential scholars, his work has a tremendous range in geographical, historical, and stylistic terms. So I first encountered David on the page, as they say, via a submission to the journal English Literary History almost 20 years ago when I was at Johns Hopkins and was on the editorial board of that journal. It was a stunning essay on Eliot's Middlemarch, which read that novel in light of a more general claim that criticism has tended to see a fatal tension between erotics and knowledge in the novel, and that Middlemarch prefigures and suggests a way out of this tendency. The article read as though written by a very seasoned scholar, but it was the work of a very junior one. And am I right that you wrote that in graduate school? Yeah, when it came out, it's got the Rutgers, but yeah. So I was like, who is this? Plus he cited me, so of course I liked him. Okay. All right. David's first book, Empty Houses, Theatrical Failure and the Novel, which was published by Princeton in 2012, traces a fascinating aspect of literary history that bears on our understanding of the novel's emphasis on psychological interiority. In this book, he focuses on the underexplored fact that theater was often a site of strong investment for key novelists of the 19th and 20th centuries, many of whom unsuccessfully attempted to write for the theater. Exploring the failed or compromised theatrical projects of major novelists in relation to the afterlife of theatrical concepts and images in their novelistic projects, David argues that we must modify our sense of the novel's emphasis on private subjective life. Through a series of highly persuasive readings, he shows that a sense of diminished public space and of what interiority excludes animates these novels and often propels them toward intimations of collective public life expressed through theatrical images or modes. The relation to public collective life and to the theater itself becomes a site of longing, linked to both loss and aspiration. David's second book, The Savage Detectives Reread, is a work that is at once deeply informed by transnational literary and critical contexts and animated by a personal engagement with the Chilean writer Roberto Bolaño's novel, The Savage Detectives, first published in 1998 and translated into English in 2007. David sees Bolaño's writing as evocative of 20th century debates on commitment, and the readings he goes on to perform themselves radiate the same form of engagement that he finds so compelling in the author under study. As is clear from this work, as well as the talk he will give tonight, which I have some sort of, prophetic knowledge of, while Kurnick is situated in an English department, he is by natural temperament a comparatist, someone who is widely read and motivated to engage transnational literary dynamics and debates. Beyond his book projects, David has written highly influential articles on many topics, including queer theory. And I particularly recommend to you his 2020 essay, A Few Lies, Queer Theory and Our Method Melodramas, which reads what are often referred to as the literary method debates, i.e. calls for surface reading, post-critique, or reparative reading, in light of both their occlusion of the important history of queer theory and activism, and their deployment of oddly melodramatic scenarios and starkly exaggerated characterologies, conflating method and ethos in ways that are distorting rather than expressive expressive of lived practical philosophies and more richly textured social dynamics. So this evening, we will hear work from his current book project, and his talk is titled Phantom Populations, Queer Densities, Rhetorics of Number in 19th Century Fiction. Please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, Amanda, for that awesome introduction and for the invitation. And thanks to everyone at the Koget, especially Ben for helping organize everything. And thank you all for being here. That paper, the Eliot thing you talked about was an alternative dissertation project that I did not pursue, and I'm pursuing it now. So there's like a paragraph in here that's sort of from that essay. I don't know quite why I have worked that way, but it's taken me forever to do this, and I guess I'm just slow, but I'm doing it. Okay, I'll start by confessing that I was surprised by the title of my talk today. I know that's an inauspicious way to begin, specifically by the appearance of the word queer there. As you know, one provides these titles well ahead of time, and the one I sent in pertains to the project I'm working on, as Amanda said, about 19th century attempts to cognize the social and the relation of those efforts to the erotic. I am going to talk about that today, especially in relation to Henry James and Balzac, but I thought it might not be uninteresting to say something about that surprise, as it has methodological implications we could talk about in the Q&A if folks are interested. As it happens, one of the other things I've been working on in this last month is a talk articulating my ambivalence about the academic use of the word queer. That ambivalence stems from the confusions between the terms sociological and evaluative registers. Both are in play in both the real world and in the academic subset of it, but the sociological one tends to live more often in the big world, where queer is a loose but referentially useful name for a few overlapping and sometimes contradictory phenomena. The aggregate of gender and sexual nonconformists, a way to designate countercultural cred or the aspiration to it, a form of signaling distance from the presumptive whiteness or gender normativity of gay and lesbian communities, and much else, as you guys all know. These uses bear a complex and sometimes contradictory relation to the one I associate with the academy, where the term is frequently an evaluative one, invested with transcendental, world-altering claims and attributable beyond specific communities to any number of social locations and even increasingly to metaphysical ones or to parts of the object world, so that we can and do now speak of queer relations or as queer form or even queer drones. Some of you may be aware of the notorious article about how killing with drones was queer. I'm happy to talk about that later. I found it a fascinating controversy, not a fascinating article, but a fascinating thing that it provoked in the Twitter sphere, at least. Anyway, that other piece that I'm working on, just so you know, looks for the origins of this habit to the early 90s, when a powerful branch of queer studies was incubated in literary criticism, especially in the work of Eve Sedgwick. My hunch is that moment saw a transfer of some of the transcendental power often attributed to the literary as such to the notion of queerness. John Guillory has recently analyzed that belief about literature as a widely held and distorting professional fantasy, and it is certainly in part that idea of the quasi-mystical power of queerness that has made me shy of the term in professional contexts. But perhaps equally irksome is the positivizing of queerness in this tradition, the suggestion that non-normative sexualities be understood as lovely and lovable before they can be deemed discussable. This was not an assumption of the literary critical work that first convinced people that paying attention to such sexualities was interesting. Sedgwick's Between Men, just for example, argued that what she called homosocial desire animated both the central institutions of 19th century Britain, homophobic and misogynist institutions basically by definition, and what looks like, from our moment, like a tradition of gay writing. That felt right to me and interesting, not only because it's obviously true that queer energies and desires need not line up with any particular political project, but also because making non-normative desires and identities available as the ground of conceptualization is only possible if you've not decided in advance that the concept always falls on a good or progressive side of some imaginary ledger. All of this is pertinent today, I hope, because the 19th century project on which I'm working takes significant inspiration from modern queer, or anyway, gay thought, or a gay practitioner of queer theory, or something. A key interlocutor for this project on realism, on the face of it an unlikely one, has been Samuel R. Delany, the 20th and 21st century writer, still living, perhaps best known as the author of dense science fiction and fantasy. In giving talks from the book project and fielding questions about the relation of this work to contemporary queer theory, I kept returning to a moment in Delany's 1988 memoir, The Motion of Light in Water, a moment famous both to readers of Delany and to those who know the 1991 Joan Wallach Scott essay, The Evidence of Experience, that centrally draws on it. That scene had powerful resonances with the patterns I was identifying in the 19th century canon, although I had in no way been aware of that as I wrote. It only became clear to me when I was talking about the project. Then, in fact, I was often thinking of this scene in the back of my mind. That scene concerns Delany's first visit to the St. Mark's Baths in New York in 1966, an occasion on which he wanders into a dimly lit upstairs room and stumbles on, quote, an undulating mass of naked male bodies, a vision that provokes in him a, quote, heart-thudding astonishment, very close to fear. The vision leads the young Delany to the following startling certainty, quote, that there was a population, not of individual homosexuals, not of hundreds, not of thousands, but rather of millions of gay men, and that history had actively and already created for us whole galleries of institutions, good and bad, to accommodate our sex. This scene echoes some of the patterns I am examining in 19th century realism, where available sensory data translates into a sense of population-wide density, and where the multiplication of bodies is rooted in eroticism but detached from heterosexual reproduction. Once I saw this resonance and wanted to write about it, I figured that the obvious thing to do would be to put Delany at the end of my book and frame his work as the afterlife of the dynamics I'm investigating in the 19th century, or simpler still, keep the resonance to myself on the theory that nobody needs to know that some paragraphs about a gay bathhouse helped me think about Jane Austen. Another option, one that I'm test driving today, would be to do things the other way around, start with Delany and see if front-loading this unlikely figure usefully defamiliarizes the realist novel that is the object of my inquiry. I mean this as more than a stunt. There are reasons of intellectual honesty that make this an attractive experiment. I read Delany's memoir in the early 1990s before I went to graduate school, and his work, along with the debates around it in the early days of what ended up being called queer theory, were very much a backdrop to my studies and to my eventual formation as something like a Victorianist. All of this is a way of saying that it seems inaccurate to suggest that Delany exists only in the after to these 19th century patterns, since in my coming to awareness of such patterns, Delany came first, or alongside. To pretend that I just happened to find something going on in realism that just happens to have this afterlife seems to falsify the process of intellectual work and to overinvest in a certain version of historicism as the default mode of argumentation in the discipline. At any rate, I am interested in what proceeding this way might allow me to say about different forms of historical thinking and literary research. To be clear, there is a historical claim here, but I don't want to make it in some of the most available idioms, of influence most obviously, even if there is, in fact, a startlingly secure paper trail from these writers to Delany. He's read everything, including very openly George Eliot and Balzac, who were interlocutors for his science fiction and fantasy work. But I want the connection to tell on the 19th century side, for the resemblance between Delany and these writers to tell us something about them. But claiming that the tradition I'm tracing is queer in the sense of subversive or in the right political column isn't what I'm after either, since that attribution seems to me to exert a subtle form of intellectual blackmail. Associating an object or argument with queerness suggests that it deserves a form of political respect or deference that queer people do. And I think as a corollary, that kind of blackmail also often lets auditors who aren't doing queer studies off the hook, as if the phrase lets them know that they don't have to take the claim too seriously. My attempted strategy in threading that needle today will be occasionally to amplify the anachronistic elements of my argument, take a few presentist detours, get explicit about the places this 19th century tradition touches on contemporary identity formations, especially gayness and lesbianism. While the modes of eroticized social apprehension discussed in the book are all perverse, in some root sense, some touch on the imagination of the mass or population generally, while others are tied to the feeling of belonging to large but discrete subgroups, especially those defined by sexuality. Today, I'll unfold the specifically homoerotic coloration the thinking of social multiplicity takes on in James and Balzac. These novels are recognizably about the socially observable and emergent figures of the gay man and the lesbian, and they are fascinated by the formal affordances of these figures for the thinking of serial modernity. But first, to offer an overview of the project's contours. Ecstasy is a number, Baudelaire wrote in his journals in the 1860s. These striking words cap off a familiar Baudelarian meditation on the joys of urban ambulation. The pleasure of being in a crowd, he writes, is a sensual joy in the multiplication of number. What's with a capital N all the time? What startles in these formulations is the way they connect the palpable experience of being among a large group of people to the abstract idea of number. Baudelaire thereby announces himself as a participant in the 19th century intellectual project that is the topic of this book in progress, the project of making the abstraction of the mass into something readers could feel. As Baudelaire's words indicate, one form that feeling took was ecstatic pleasure. In the background of this project is the claim that quantity and its opposition to something called quality was inflected in the 19th century by a newly acute perception of increased quantities of people, what Emily Steinlein has called in her book on the population concept, quote, the palpable pressure of human aggregation. Since its origins in antiquity, the conceptual doublet of quality and quantity was usually taken to signal a divide between the perceptible and the non-perceptible. We might ascertain, for example, with a scale, that a book weighs 2 pounds, but that quantitative data is not a feature of our experience of it. But the prominence of the population debates in the 19th century, the fact that there were increasing numbers of people around and new disciplinary languages in which to conceive of them, affected a shift in these associations. Increasingly, quantification was associated not only with the abstraction away from sensory particulars, but with a form of sensory intensity. Indeed, in places, the adjectives that still cling like Homeric epithets to the nouns number and quantity, sheer number, mere quantity, took on a curious status as sensory intensifiers in the period, such that abstraction could be imagined for the first time as a heightened sensory condition. Recall how Steinleit's metaphor, the palpable pressure of human aggregation, suggests that if quantities themselves aren't perceptible, the very fact of quantity might be, specifically as a kind of bombardment of the sensory surface or as the press of flesh on flesh. I think at the end of the century, I don't have time to talk about this today, but that aestheticism is picking up on some of these associations, specifically with the idea of the numericalizing of impressions. If you think of the end of the Peters the Renaissance, talking about the necessity of multiplying the number of impulses you can get into a certain interval, it's well known that there's a kind of sexual use of that, the kind of amoralizing of intensity as a kind of non-moralizing, non-semanticized impression. I think there's a connection to this population conversation as well about the intensity of that bombardment with data. But even before aestheticism, and that has an afterlife, I think, in Freud and some other places too, we can talk about if you're curious. But anyway, even before aestheticism got hold of this suggestive set of metaphors, sexual connotations, as Steinlein shows, were inherent in population thinking from the beginning. Her book takes the 1798 publication of the first edition of Malthus's Essay on Population as the trigger and focal point for the 19th century's population debates. And she writes that, quote, sexuality more than almost any other element of the argument was a sticking point in the controversy that greeted the book. She goes on to note that the inevitability with which Malthus biologizes sexuality and links it to reproduction meets with surprisingly inconsistent counter-arguments. Opponents like Godwin and Hazlitt painted Malthus as a sex-obsessed sensualist, while Percy Shelley saw him as an asexual and anti-sexual figure, an enemy of love. We could say that sex, however inconsistently understood, provided the nimbus in which the population debates occurred. For obvious reasons, the sex overtly at stake here was heterosexual and reproductive. The bogey people that haunted this discourse were predictably the dangerously fecund female, the dangerously lustful male, the dissipated working classes, and the depraved and fertile non-white races. You know about that. But the sense of a newly populous social field also resonated with sexuality in ways not reducible to heterosexual reproduction or to these specific tropes. The realist novel played a key role in this development by positing the sublime largeness of the social as a source of a definitionally perverse erotic magnetism, touching on heterosexuality and reproduction contingently, if at all. So the book offers 3 main modalities whereby the novel's intimation of social scale is marked by an erotic agitation of text or character. 3 main techniques whereby the realist text achieves an eroticized sociological resonance. I call them, for now, the erotics of anonymous celebrity, typological erotics, and the erotics of sublime incorporation. Today I'll concentrate on the latter 2 modes, but I want just to sketch what I mean by the erotics of anonymous celebrity. This idea proceeds from the observation that literary characters are famous in a basic sense of the term. One crucial feature of the ontology of fictional characters is their quality of being knowable by a large public. Since the advent of print, fictional character has been a form of imaginary personhood rendered publicly accessible by technologies of distribution that move through social worlds far larger than any individual can inhabit. And since the 18th century explosion of the book market, that distribution has operated on a mass scale. We are accustomed to thinking of readers' relation to characters in epistemological terms as a kind of surveillance. We know more about characters than they do about us, for example. But we might equally understand the relation as a form of celebrity and ask how it is that none of the people surrounding Emma Bovary or Baker Thomas or Nancy Drew know how sheerly famous they are, how many beholders they have. Of course, in their story world existence, such characters may be little known, unpopular, even downright obscure. But the media platform by which readers have historically accessed, say, the story of Jude Folly, a mass-distributed codex, means that we encounter Hardy's beleaguered hero as famously obscure, a paradox that Hardy's mock heroic title, of course, renders explicit, as if Jude the Obscure were a king that no one had ever heard of. In an article drawn from this project, I've claimed that Jane Austen is the unlikely bard of this conflation of fame and anonymity, or one of them, arguing that at key moments in her novel Persuasion, the novel's diegetic plot, Anne and Wentworth's long-tried love for one another, merges with that plot's mediatic condition in which both of them are the objects of mass attention. The result, I say, is that the book's plot becomes an allegory of a media condition coming to consciousness of itself, as if the novel is intimating to its characters a charged awareness of their celebrity quality. In doing so, I claim Persuasion also eroticizes readers' apprehension of our mass status. This modality evinces a nonphobic mode of thinking about mass being, a powerful affordance of this style of mediatic feeling that persisted throughout the century. I know that's a very impacted version of that argument. I can explain it at greater depth if you're interested. Basically, I was trying to figure out why that book, no matter how many times I teach it or read it, makes me cry in a very specific place. And I don't think it's because I'm excited that they're getting married, because I know they're getting married. It's got something to do with the way the choreography of the focalization and the brilliant last scene kind of manages my sense of myself as a reader, among many. Anyway, it's the second two modalities I'd like to focus on today. With typological erotics, I want to capture the emergent sense that belonging to a class of people like oneself is becoming an eroticized possibility. For reasons already audible in that definition, and that I hope will become clearer in the next few minutes, this form of eroticization is particularly amenable to homoerotic elaboration. I'll unfold it today primarily in relation to Henry James, who was especially interested in social typology in his novels of the 1880s. The Bostonians is one of the long fictions of that decade, along with The Princess Casamassima, both from 1886, and The Tragic Muse. This is kind of the unloved part of James's career by many. I'm looking at Stuart, and he's like, why is David going to talk about this? I really love these books. Those three books, they're famous for taking up issues of political and social representation that remain peripheral in his earlier and later work. Even in this context, though, the Bostonians' relation to typology is peculiarly intense. James's notes for the novel were full of ideas about the types that would fill it, and that language is all over the novel itself. Most notoriously when Basil Ransom, toward the beginning, asks himself upon meeting his cousin Olive Chancellor, why was she morbid and why was her morbidness typical? Nothing, Basil reflects a bit later, would induce him to make love to such a type as that. It's a super mean novel, but also kind of amazing. It's a super homophobic novel, but as a lesbian friend of mine said, it's like he had ESP. It's also like a very precise delineation of a certain kind of lesbian subjectivity, according to at least one lesbian who I trust on these matters. So its homophobia is really interesting related to its intensity of how much it delineates his character. The question of typology is here in Basil's reflection, I would not want to make love to such a type as that. That question of typology is imbued here with the tonalities of an emergent sexology, with its excited catalogs of erotic pathology. And of course, the Bostonians has long been recognized as offering in Olive one of the earliest and most psychologically detailed novelistic portraits of the lesbian as a new category. Officially, of course, the novel is about feminism, which is to say that the Bostonians is equally adequately described as a triangle in which Verena Tarrant must choose between Basil and Olive, the cousins, and as a triangle in which Verena must choose between Basil and women as a class. One leg of this purportedly interpersonal triangle opens onto a vision of social multiplicity. I don't think we can dispel that imbalance by claiming that the feminist version of the story is simply the Victorian cover for the real story that we are readier to perceive than the novel's first readers. Rather, the originality of the Bostonians lies in its figuration of lesbianism as multiplicity. Jennifer Fleissner has persuasively argued that the Bostonians is less about the emblem of the new woman than about the, quote, logic of emblematization itself. A characterization, I would say, can only be bettered by registering the intensity of the novel's desiring motor and saying it's animated by an erotics of emblematization. Another description suggests itself in this light. The romantic contest between Basil and Olive is not over who will possess the anemic Verena, but over access to the categorical. Basil's courtship consistently takes the form of a resistance to categorical thinking. Confronted with feminist argument, he responds with a reduction of his field of vision to the individual. The pattern is relentless. A couple examples. Asked if he is converted to Miss Tarrant's cause, he replies that he is converted to Miss Tarrant, decidedly. When he does this over and over. When Verena objects to his characterization of modern woman as fatuous, he exempts her. You stand apart. You are unique, extraordinary. You constitute a category by yourself. It even gets kind of lewd and gross at certain points, and somebody says, oh, her arguments have acted upon so many, and he says, well, I hope they act upon me. It feels like he's constantly taunting with this idea that her reduction to her singularity will also be, obviously just make her available erotically. That's what they both mean. Olive, meanwhile, the cousin, the competitor, pursues the opposite strategy, what we might call a will to categoricalness. She is, we are told, quote, exceedingly fond of illustrations of laws, and of course, hates men as a class. She considered men in general as so much in the debt of the opposite sex that any individual woman had an unlimited credit with them. She could not possibly overdraw the general feminine account. We might expect Olive's generalizing bent to incline her toward the aridity of abstraction, but in fact her classifying imagination is deeply erotically invested. It is, for example, precisely Verena's connection to the numerous poor that fires Olive's desire. The Tarrant family's vulgarity, James writes, quote, threw Verena into a social dusk of that mysterious democracy, and slots her perfectly into Olive's long-standing romance of the people. Ultimately, this generalizing tendency is no less sexually charged than Basil's opposite habit. Talking to Verena, Olive insists that her awareness of women's oppression inflames her entire being. I always feel it, everywhere, night and day. I feel it here, she indicates, placing her hand on her breast, as a deep, unforgettable wrong. I feel it as one feels a stain that is on one's honor. Verena draws out the erotic meanings latent here when she tells Basil that Olive, quote, just quivers when she describes what our sex has been through. How we understand this bodily agitation depends on the hermeneutic status we accord Olive's lesbianism. We could read this all as a joke, a fairly mean-spirited one at her expense. On this reading, Olive's feminism is the symptom of her lesbianism, her passion for the category of woman, a screen for a disavowed passion for individual women. But lesbianism is so persistently tied to the categorical in the novel that they become indistinguishable. This relation was the obscurely grasped point of a contemporary review in The Atlantic. Praising James's handling of the relation between Olive and Verena, the reviewer presents a curiously circular syntax in which the femaleness of both makes their passionate attachment superpersonal. Quote, what renders the portrayal of Olive even more fine as a personal portrait is the admixture of passionate womanly appropriation of the girl whom she looks upon as the young priestess of the new church of womanhood. It's a weird sentence, and I'm not even sure they're using admixture properly, so the important part is it's a really good portrait because of the passionate womanly appropriation of the girl whom Olive looks upon as the young priestess of the new church of womanhood. The chiasmus here is the more striking for seeming half-conscious. The woman worships the girl who is herself an officiant at the altar of womanhood. In this hall of mirrors, lesbianism becomes a route to the categorical, the means through which each woman apprehends her participation in the category of woman and invests that apprehension with an erotic charge. If I've been making James sound as if he has obtained century-early galleys of Adrian Rich's compulsory heterosexuality and lesbian existence of 1980 with its famous theorization of the lesbian continuum as a, quote, range of woman-identified experience, that's precisely my intention. Rich's essay has been criticized for desexualizing lesbianism by rendering it meaninglessly general, for defining, quote, the sharing of a rich inner life, the bonding against male tyranny, the giving and receiving of practical and political support as forms of primary intensity between and among women that she thinks we might call lesbian. But the Jamesian text makes us perceive, even through the ambiguous lens of the novel's overinvested satire, that making general as an ecstatic and exalted vocation. The language of religious fervor that the Atlantic reviewer employs is by no means a fanciful importation. The reviewer is picking up on a motif in the novel whereby James arrays the women in the novel in devotional relation to a mythic female forebear who is herself famous for her ecstatic devotion to a superpersonal cause. Verena likens her apprehension of the condition of womanhood to, quote, Joan of Arc's idea of the suffering of France, and the claim is, quote, so prettily said that Olive could scarce keep from kissing her. Olive herself, near the novel's climax, is compared to the, quote, sacrificial figure of Hypatia, whirled through the furious mob of Alexandria. And we've already been told that Olive's appetite for feminist agitation is quickened by the ecstasy of the martyr. Like the woman who worships a girl who worships women, these invocations of the heroic present us with a woman who worships a woman who worships a force larger than herself. The effect is not only to invest the movement to the trans individual with the energy of desire, but to give that will to the categorical and indicative homosexual style. James's use of the rhetoric of heroic precursors places the Bostonians in a longer tradition. That use points fairly explicitly to George Eliot's Middlemarch, the canonical novelistic instance of sexualized typification. Middlemarch's prelude famously contrasts the novel's heroine, Dorothea Brooke, to St. Teresa, a juxtaposition that prompts a sociological apprehension. Eliot first names the singular historical St. Teresa, then turns to her latter-day descendant, a figure she calls a St. Teresa, before turning at the prelude's close to a laterally configured category of many St. Teresas. Those of you who know this terrific article by Catherine Gallagher about this passage, sort of following her moves here. She also notes the intense eroticism of that passage. For Gallagher, it gets closed down in marriage to will at the end, and that's kind of the fate of this eroticism. I think it's much more interesting to hold on for a second at the relation between Dorothea and all these other Dorotheas. Several commentators, and I believe Gallagher is one of them, have suggested that Eliot was thinking of Bernini's notorious statue in Rome of Teresa in ecstasy when she wrote these words. And the prelude suggests that an ecstatic energy characterizes not only Teresa's relationship to her God and Dorothea's relationship to her epic forebear, but also Dorothea's relationship to her fellows, that is, to her own representativeness. I'm pretty sure Eliot's novel is the unconscious intertext for Irving Howe's description of Olive in his 1956 Introduction to the Modern Library edition of the Bostonians as a, quote, St. Teresa of Beacon Hill. While that comparison is in fact nowhere in the Bostonians, James's rhetoric nevertheless casts a backward light over Eliot's text, illuminating a latent homoness in the modern novel's key passage for imagining sociological grandeur. The perverse tropism of the categorical is even clearer in another text James knew well, Flaubert's Madame Bovary. The erotic climax of that novel comes not when Emma first has sex with Rodolphe, but immediately after, when she hurries to her room to repeat to herself the words, I have a lover. By which she means, Flaubert makes clear, I am the kind of woman who has a lover, which in turn means something like, I am ecstatically included in the class of women who have lovers. Flaubert writes, quote, she recalled the heroines of the books she had read, and this lyrical host of adulterous women began to sing in her memory with sisterly voices that enchanted her. She herself was in some way becoming an actual part of those imaginings by seeing herself as this type of amorous woman she had so envied. This is the only time in the novel that the word type appears. The moment suggests a new way to configure Emma Bovary's two most famous characteristics, her polymorphous sensuality and her addiction to romantic fiction. Both have, of course, been central to accounts of Flaubert's modernity. Emma's hyperreceptivity to sensation and the essential inauthenticity of her experience together make her the perfect bearer of Flaubert's style with its radically de-hierarchized economy of attention. This is a familiar story and a convincing one, but it's important to note that Emma's fugitive eroticism finds its key form in this sororal ecstasy, this magnetism toward the type. The Bostonians often reads as if Olive Chancellor has ingested these novelistic forebears, compressing Dorothea's ardency and Emma's hypersensitivity into the sexualized space of her intensified being. James recycles intensity and its semantic relatives so frequently to characterize his heroine that they become inseparable from her being. She has, quote, an intense sensibility. She is intensely, fearfully a person, concentrated, determined, definite, and literal. She is white with the intensity of her self-consciousness, her face intensely grave. Even glimpsed from behind across a crowded auditorium, she conveys to Ransom, quote, a kind of rapturous stillness, the concentration of triumph. The rhetoric of rapturous concentration and quivering intensity does more than up the ante on Eliot's language of ardency, Because James has correlated this intensity so closely to Olive's political desire, it also lays bare this passion's categorical underpinnings, so that Olive's intensity becomes a hinge between the erotically agitated and the simply numerous, between the pressure of the personal and the demographically expansive. Olive's intensity is an impacted multiplicity, her lesbian feminism a way of living one's categorical being ecstatically. James's other major political novel of the decade, The Princess Casamassima, will in fact do something cognate with the figure of male homosexuality, which opens there not onto feminism, but onto mass leftist politics. I'm happy to get into that crazy novel in the Q&A if folks want, but I want to turn in the next and last part of this talk to another key novelistic modality my book explores, a mode to which the figure of the gay man turns out to be central. I call that modality the erotics of sublime incorporation, and with it I have in mind the extraordinary 19th century invention that is the realist series. Balzac's Human Comedy, comprising nearly 100 stories and novels, Zola's Rougon Macquart series with 20 novels, Benito Pérez Galdos's Episodios Nacionales, national episodes, that's 46 novels, and his contemporary Spanish novel series, which is 22 novels. These encyclopedic projects aspire to total coverage of their chosen topic. We might think of them as wanting to absorb the entirety of the world into their textual interior, as if in anticipation of Borges's map that exists on a scale of 1 to 1 with the territory it charts. The realist series is a 19th century invention whose form asks how the partiality of any made artifact comes to seem to encompass a whole. These questions are particularly fraught at the textual edges, those places where the aesthetic artifact marks its closure from the world and thereby comes to seem like a scale model of the world. Balzac's Pergorio from 1835 represents by his own account the moment in which he first hit on his scheme of recurring characters as the formal device that would link his massive multi-part narrative structure. So in a sense, that novel is itself a frontier of or a frame for the entire project. Pergorio does not only stand at the head of one of the first self-conscious attempts to map the social whole in fictional narrative, it is also, by some accounts, the novel with, quote, the first three-dimensional homosexual character of modern fiction, whose love is not automatically condemned. Balzac's recent biographer Graham Robb awards this distinction to Vautrin, the arch-villain who offers the novel's hero Rastignac a devil's bargain, briefly to arrange for the murder of a young man who's supposed to inherit the fortune that will otherwise fall to a young woman who wants to marry Rastignac. So make him rich by getting somebody killed who doesn't deserve it. It's the problem of the hypothetical Mandarin. He says, would you kill a Chinese guy across the world if you didn't have to know about it? And of course, this is a more proximate vision of that, but that's a famous kind of moral puzzle of the novel. And Rastignac sort of agrees and sort of doesn't. Vautrin, though, is the guy who engineers this whole story. Vautrin, as Balzac will later say, the spine that links this novel to the later Lost Illusions and to The Splendor and Misery of Courtesans, a series of books that has come to be known as the Vautrin trilogy, because each turns on the schemes for advancement that this mastermind proposes to the novel's comely male heroes. In the interlinked system of the human comedy, then, Vautrin's serial desirous patronage plays an inaugural and structuring role. This gay male character is born along with, and in a sense for the sake of, and as the joints of, Balzac's comprehensive narrative project. Vautrin's habit of popping up and resurfacing, like his criminality and his joie de vivre, align him with the genre of the picaresque, and that genre does seem to run in the background of the set of Bildungsroman that Vautrin traverses, like a ghostly architectural frame or a hidden motor. In a moment, we'll see that Vautrin is not only associated with this backstage or subterranean realm, but through it with an intense rhetoric of number, and number as intensity. But I want to back into this point with a brief detour into the 20th and 21st centuries, where the connection between male homosexuality and number is firmly established in the gay writing of promiscuity. It's visible in the title of books like John Rechy's Numbers from 1967, Renaud Camus' Tricks from 1981, Brontez Purnell's 100 Boyfriends from 2021, books whose picaresque form approaches the sheer parataxis of catalog, one man after another. In fact, the connection between quantity and male homosexuality is central to one of the key texts of queer theory. Leo Bersani's 1987 essay, Is the Rectum a Grave, takes as its memorable first epigraph a statement from a Johns Hopkins AIDS researcher named Upendra Narayan to the effect that, quote, these people, promiscuous gay men, have sex 20 to 30 times a night. A man comes along and goes from anus to anus and in a single night will act as a mosquito transferring infected cells on his penis. When this is practiced for a year, with a man having 3,000 sexual intercourses, one can readily understand this massive epidemic that is currently upon us. Bersani wants us to register, beyond the dehumanizing homophobia of Narayan's metaphor, the sheer physical impossibility of the quantities he offers, but that Bersani views this numerical insectoid sublime with something other than sheer disgust is clear when he says that the words, along with the fantasy of a one Judge Richard Wallach that gay bathhouses were spaces of, quote, orgiastic behavior of multiple partners, one after the other, where in 5 minutes you can have 5 contacts. All of this, Bersani says, offers a certain morbid delight to the gay reader. Bersani goes on to put these fantasies in a cultural and literary historical tradition pertinent to the subject of my book, noting first that these claims are, quote, much less descriptive of even the most promiscuous male sexuality than they are reminiscent of male fantasies about women's multiple orgasms. And then that, quote, this is still Bersani, promiscuity is the social correlative of a sexuality physiologically grounded in the menacing phenomenon of the non-climactic climax. Bersani's insight that passive sexuality, in men as in women, becomes a figure for promiscuity will be central to the literary historical arc of my project, and one of my central arguments will be that fictional promiscuity is also an approach to an apprehension of demographic amplitude. Some of the complexity of promiscuity as an object of commentary is perceptible in the tonal ambiguity that attends Bersani's mocking citations. The delight he avows here testifies to a resonance between these homophobic fantasies and a gay male discourse around numbers, a form of boasting and exaggeration that is also a report from a distinctive social experience. Quote, promiscuity was the lingua franca, the Esperanto of the male homosexual community, the novelist Andrew Holleran wrote in Notes on Promiscuity, a ruefully retrospective essay published contemporaneously with Bersani's in 1987 at the height of the epidemic. In a formal mimesis of the structure of promiscuity, Holleran's essay comprises 92 numbered aphorisms. Number 12 reads in its entirety, "It takes time to become promiscuous. Married couples reading stories about AIDS are astounded to learn that a homosexual man has slept with 800 men. To the homosexual reader, this does not seem that bizarre." Support for the claim comes not only from the titles cited above, as from Delany's collected work, not short on numerical tallies of sexual partners, but from the lived experience of some not inconsiderable portion of gay men, for whom one's estimated number, as the kids put it, works as a reliable index of social difference. One way to translate this observation into the terms of novelistic aesthetics is to note that the big round figure of 800, a number that seems to belong to the realm of statistics or sociology, is in Holleran's account a verisimilar quality in the lives of many gay men. This fact both assimilates the gay man as fictional protagonist to a long literary tradition and marks a certain novelty. On the one hand, the literary affordances of this character's serial sexuality resemble those of the picaro, the prostitute, you might think of Roxanne or Nana, and the detective from 20th century, you might think of The Big Sleep. All of these figures anchor narratives in which, as Frederick Jameson puts it, quote, a single character moves from one background to another, linking picturesque but not intrinsically related episodes together in an effort to offer an apprehension of society as a whole. On the other hand, there are salient differences between this protagonist and his relatives, foremost among them the fact that his adventures aren't usually motivated by the necessities or alibis of economic survival or professional honor or the solution of a crime. The very hedonism of this figure lends his project a certain purity of motive, suggesting that his pursuit of pleasure is fictionally available anyway to shade into a larger cognitive project. Seeing things this way helps us see the critical potential of using this figure as an interpretive tool for an earlier historical moment, a heuristic whose anachronistic strangeness lights up the 19th century novel of social comprehension in surprising ways. Vautrin, it turns out, is as obsessed with numbers as the 20th and 21st century gay protagonists, who in this respect he strangely resembles. Alone among the characters in Père Goriot, he is granted a nearly 10-page-long unparagraphed monologue delivered to the hero Rastignac on the long odds for success in competitive Paris. If the passage's sheer length allows Vautrin briefly to usurp the narrator's privilege of managing the story, the content of these pages suggests that a rapturous poetry of number is the narration's fuel, its secret generator. The recourse to quantification in the passage is incessant. Vautrin boastfully labels himself Mr. 4 million, an allusion to the amount he says he plans to earn upon moving to the United States and going into business as a plantation owner and slaveholder. Rastignac, that's his plan for after the book ends. He doesn't do it, as it turns out. Rastignac himself will need at least 1 million, Vautrin insists, and the older man can see that Rastignac has, quote, an appetite big enough to get you into 20 scrapes a day. He points out to the law student that there are, quote, only 20 crown prosecutors in the whole of France, and there are some 20,000 of you aspiring to that rank. He then amends the odds to insist that Rastignac is competing with 50,000 young men, all in the same position as you. and then again to claim that, quote, among the 100 professions you might pursue, if there are 10 men who succeed overnight, the public calls them thieves, and that for every 1,000,000 sheep, you'll find 10 likely lads. These are not, of course, sexual numbers, even if their rehearsal verges on the ecstatic. And in another crucial difference from Vautrin's more overtly promiscuous descendants, this numerical cascade does not seem to be the result of personal calculations. We don't know how Vautrin has come to his knowledge, if knowledge it is, but we don't think it's because he has knocked on doors and done the math. Unlike Halloran's 800, these numbers lay no claim to experience. Or at least this seems to be the case until the peroration concludes with the weirdly precise claim that, quote, out of 60 fashionable weddings taking place in Paris, there are 47 which turn on the kind of corrupt brokerage Vautrin is offering. So he offers that particular number. The swerve from the rounded numbers and easily calculated quotients is abrupt. If the preceding pages have seemed to approach the condition of a sublime numerical plateau looming over the space of the plot, if Vautrin has seemed for a moment less like an earthbound character than some demonic inhabitant of those altitudes, here we have to imagine him rappelling down from those heights, using this oddly specific fraction, 47 over 60, as a kind of toehold to step back onto the mortal plane of the realist fiction. However improbable, the numbers are not, after all, utterly beyond the realm of belief. They have the ring of almost plausibility. Given the sprawl of the human comedy that Balzac is here in the process of conceptualizing and the outsized role that Vautrin will play in this project's interlinking systems, it's not that hard to imagine that the man we meet in Père Goriot may have either literally arranged or been personally party to 47 such schemes. The verisimilitude offered here unites Vautrin once again with Halloran's Mr. 800, sets him squarely on what we might think of as a sociological boundary, the ineffable line where lived experience touches on large-scale knowledge. One way to describe this boundary is as a space of what Jacques Rancière has called the, quote, conjunction between the sensible and the supersensible. He offers the phrase in an interview where he claims that secular fiction makes the implicit proposal to its readers that, quote, you have to pay with your own flesh if you want that imagination really to change your life. To suggest that Balzac's Vautrin resides on the border where the experience of the flesh becomes one with a properly abstract and supersensible form of knowledge is thus to enlist him in a very old tradition. For Rancière, it reaches back to Don Quixote's sense that what he knows from books must be verified in the body, and beyond that to the idea of the incarnation of the Christ as a technology for, quote, making the truth of the scriptures become sensory reality. The examples I have surveyed today adapt that very old tradition to the technologies of enumeration emergent in the 19th century, and as we've seen, that updating takes on a distinctive homoerotic coloration. The particular examples I've explored today are classically overdetermined. In the Bostonians, James sees as interested in the sameness or homoness of a couple formed by people of the same gender as he is in the bluestocking phenomenon. Père Goriot is meanwhile evidently inspired by the social fact that itinerants, prostitutes, criminals, and Balzac saw gay men could bear special narrative material, even as he also leverages this social fact for his formal ingenuity. What these conceptualizations share is the fantasy of a non-reproductive sexuality that is yet phantasmatically productive, a sexuality that gives free rein to the possibility of making copies without making babies. To be clear, I'm not offering this as some preferable alternative to making babies. I am noticing that in its distance from the question of reproduction, this tradition cathects the object of population in the mode not of terror but of erotic pleasure. Of course, fiction as such might also be understood as a non-catastrophic technology for making new people. And indeed, it was so understood in the period. David Mason, the Scottish critic whose 1869 book, British Novelists and Their Styles, represents the first book-length academic study of its subject, repeatedly marvels at the way the novel makes phantom populations. The century's explosion of printed matter, he points out excitedly, also entailed a vast addition of imaginary people to the world's mental furniture. Quote, in the very air over our heads, and in contact, nay, in interfusion and connection with the actual world to which we belong, flutters there not another, an invisible world of secondary origin, myriads of beings forming in their union a great population. These words, in finding a vocabulary for gleeful agitation at a population explosion, might seem an outlier in the century of Malthus, but that lyricism of population was a central fact of the century's fiction. Thanks.
So thanks, David. That's terrific. Thank you. It's such an interesting. Of course, I'm going to ask you about the Bostonians. It's such a your reading is such an interesting one. It's going to take me a little while to work through it. But I want to ask you about if you can stage your argument in relation to the form of the novel, because it's it's obviously it's the odd man out for James, right? It is singular in the sense, obviously, he leaves it out of the New York edition, and he has this strange. I mean, I've never understood why he kind of disavows it, but it is singular in certain aspects. It's the only extended use of free and direct discourse in James, and so almost all of both Olive and Ransom's judgments and observations, are couched in free and direct discourse. And it's obviously also a novel that is obsessed with questions of voice. I mean, that's to say something very obvious, but Verena, the voice speaks through Verena. You have all these public spaces in the novel, the symphony hall where it ends. There's actually a scene on the T. There's a scene, obviously, of two scenes of public lectures. There's the newspaper. So I'm wondering how your argument about number and about type works in relationship to this kind of singular form of the novel in James's oeuvre, and more generally about its fascination with questions of voice and the public.
Yeah,
it's a large question, I know. So.
Yeah, that's a big one, but it's great. I hadn't thought of it in terms of the FID thing, the free and direct discourse thing, but that's a really interesting point. I thought of it more, its formal weirdness has to do, I mean, it's not weird in James, but it's notable in the novel that the contest between the two cousins is managed in terms of focalization, so that you can tell who's winning because you can tell who we're with, and once we kind of abandon Olive, increasingly it becomes this kind of distressing sense that we don't know what's going on with her, but we know she's lost track. I mean, you think about her waiting in Washington Square Park while Verena's on this horrifying, if you've ever been jilted and jealous, it's like the worst scene in the history of literature, because it's just like, she said she'd be gone for an hour, and then it's like, she's like, I'll give her 3, and then I'll come back and see if she's there. And then I think this one we are focalized through Olive, and so she finally goes back, and it's that sense of, but then the focalization is handed over to Basil, and we kind of sense that she's losing. In terms of, I mean, FID, I think there's something about the openness of that form to, as Verena, thematizes that kind of public voice, right? Sense of the public voice being contested, and the questions not only psychological, I guess. That's one thing I think, since usually James's method is to, the interesting question is who's thinking, who knows what. It seems really different when voice is the thing. Who's speaking? I mean, it really seems like a historically sensitive meditation on that question. Who's going to win? This historical game as well. I mean, the story that we're seeing between the 3 players is clearly a kind of stand-in for that, I think. And even though Basil wins the plot, the love plot, we're told that it's unhappy. We're also told, I think the other thing that's uncharacteristic about that novel, it's not just that it's got those public scenes, which are really uncharacteristic of James, but it also ends almost uniquely in the 19th century on a total cliffhanger. We know that the private plot has closed down in one way, that Verena's going to go off with Basil, but then it ends in the most bananas way possible, that Olive steps onto a stage to either be booed and torn limb from limb somehow. That's almost the fear, or to become some orator in a science fiction alternative universe in which she is this big feminist, heroine. And the novel, of course, we don't think that's what happens. And there's realism in the novel that suggests that we know that didn't happen. But it's a very weird place to end, with her just confronting the social in its sheerest form, like a big crowd. I think he compares it. I mean, it's Boston, right? How scary can it be? But it's compared to, he compares is it the music hall to a Roman auditorium. The chanting of the crowd, and they're baying for her for something, and it's like they're going to kill someone or they're going to celebrate someone. But it's totally Dionysian, really scary. That's a very weird place for a novel by anyone to end in the 19th century, much less by the master of psychology, just to push her out on stage and be done. We have no idea what, but she's just fronting on publicity, So I think that, yeah.
Thank you so much for this really inspiring talk. I'm still trying to think about many things that you said, suggested. I have two thoughts. They are not fully formed. One is about statistics, and I was wondering if what you call the rapture of numbers, of statistics, does it have to do with commodification, with maybe the fantasy, the dream, the desire of either being a commodity, being like a commodity, or of loving commodity, or so that's one thought that I had. And the other one is, well, you focused on 19th century and also 20th century literature. I was wondering if one takes a small step back. Actually, I kept thinking about the Marquis de Sade and numbers. I mean, numbers are everywhere in Sade. A fascination with numbers, almost to the point of boredom. Series, repetitive, iterative groupings, exhaustion, etc. And there's a kind of mathematical sublime in Sade. There's also something about the supra-sensible. I mean, if we follow, Lacan's famous idea that Kant and Sade belong together somehow, there's the idea that in Sade, you have this categorical imperative, which is actually the reverse of but also the same as Kant's categorical imperative. You just have to keep doing it through numbers, basically, up to infinity. So I was up to beyond exhaustion. I mean, it has to do with also jouissance, enjoyment as beyond pleasure. So I was wondering, well, maybe simply if Sade is part of your constellation.
Yeah, not yet, but that's a great question. Those are both really interesting. I mean, I'm curious what you're thinking about with the commodity question, because I mean, the commodity that I'm mostly thinking of is like the book as an object that mediates all of this, and that somehow, and that one's awareness that our pleasure in books has something to do with, I mean, I think we know from I think most of the way book history arguments kind of tend to cash out are somewhat deflationary, right? Like you think you're having this intense experience, but actually it's just an object, right? It's like a toaster, it's like a thing like that. And so of course books are things like that in that sense, but they're also clearly different. And usually I want to defend, my sense of books' specialness by saying, oh, but they're different than a toaster because I don't sit with my toaster for 3 hours and have all these feelings and thoughts, there's something specific to this. But on the other hand, there is something, but I mean, there's an element I think that we have underexplored of group feeling that just is the basic material of all fictional experience, that we just, even our privacy or our particular sense of intimacy just has to be conditioned by the sense of its mass distribution. And I don't think we exactly talk about that, especially not about that as affording a certain kind of pleasure or a certain way of experiencing commodity distribution as something other than just alienating or whatever the things we think it is. I mean, also, the other thing I'm thinking of, but I'm again curious what you had in mind. I mean, the relation of the gay man to this, the actual tradition of like the courtesan novel and the prostitute is obviously central, and that's something that Balzac is obsessed with. And so Vautrin, of course, has his kind of opposite number in these women that he prostitutes, as well as these men that he patronizes. And Nana is, of course, maybe the classic place for this, where commodities and are specifically, her commodification is exactly what makes her this object of sublime, numerically expansive. I mean, it's much more explicit than it is even here. So there's hardly any kind of interpretive work to do to draw that out, since that's what Zola, what's his name, is constantly talking about. That Nana is, she represents all of France. She, millions of, literally the actual amounts that pour through her as a kind of system are what the kind of, there's a lyricism of that's quite explicit. So those are the two places I would think of in answer to your question, but you might have been thinking of other kinds of commodities. Or other literary sites.
I was actually thinking it's a bit remote, but there's a wonderful sentence somewhere in Benjamin I believe it's in the Arcades project, but I'm not sure. Or when he talks about Baudelaire, and he imagines the kind of love that commodities elicit in their buyer. So he thinks of this consumer relation as a relation of love, which is both really surprising and I think also worth thinking
for
about.
sure. No, I mean, I think that's right. And I think the relation of that whole discourse to the Flaneur and all that is totally right. I just think there's more traffic between that tradition and other descriptions of, like, for example, I think with Lukács, and I was reading today, because, you know, he of course is really into the type, but he's not into like the average, and of course he's not into commodities, and he's at pains to say the type is this intense concentration of all these historical dynamics. It's not the average. It's not about statistics. And it's sort of like, okay, but is there any relation between that attempt to kind of condense muchness in a kind of apprehensible quality and that other thing that you don't like? So I think there's traffic there. In terms of Kant, I mean, I can only quickly say, I guess, that, the difference seems to me, I mean, I hear that kind of recombinatorial sublime, that kind of mathematical sublime. All these things tend to go up. Like everything in the 19th century, it's not just like you play the numbers and you'll kind of lose your mind in a kind of maybe more philosophically responsible way, but there's something about the multiplication that 10 always becomes 10,000, becomes a million. And so the numbers, that is a different kind of numerical imagination that hits a different kind of sublime. I mean, I think this is just a way of saying that all those concerns with number get inflected by, I mean, most immediately the population explosion, but there's just the proliferation of stuff in the world, most especially people, but just that there's a sense that changes the ground rules of even kind of philosophical questions about number. They can no longer avoid this other and a really sensorily pressing context, if that makes sense, or even like ground, I would say, more than context. I think there's someone back there. Yeah.
Hello, thank you. That was super interesting. Sort of related to Peter's talk, as a question. Sorry.
Wait, I didn't hear what you said, but everyone's laughing, so I want to hear it.
So I said in relation to Peter's talk, I mean question. That was completely unintentional. I'm wondering the extent to which the word token could also be relevant here, particularly in relation to commodification, just because you have this concept of type, and you have types of commodities, and of course there's tokens within those types such that they're fungible, right? And of course now you have non-fungible tokens and so forth. So the type is, Marx refers to a coat, and then there's individual coats are tokens of that type. And so I think it's useful when you think about the example you gave from Madame Bovary, where she goes into a room and she says, I have a lover, and then I am the sort of person who has a lover. I am the sort of person who identifies with the sort of person that has a lover. Mm-hmm. And from there, I wonder the extent to which she is a token of a type that fits into either of those categories, twice removed or once removed or whatever, or if it's the inauguration of a whole new type, right? A whole new sort of subjectivity, which kind of links up nicely with this quote you had at the end about new people being created by literature. So that was kind of more of a thought. And then also in relation to having more than one lover, I just wonder, and I'm putting this out there, is, say, having 3 lovers its own thing, or is it the same as having 2 + 1 lovers, right? And so this idea again of like, what is the ontology of that sexual moment or whatever? Is it its own thing? Like, is 800, having sex with 800 people, is that the same as having sex with 800 individual people? Does that make sense? It's that last point you can feel free to forget, but this kind of ontology.
Well, no, I mean, I started it, so I know it's like, I talked about that.
It somehow relates to this distinction between token and type. Is, say, the specificity of, say, 800 lovers different from the specificity of 800 individual lovers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really. The word token I haven't tracked at all as like a particular or even as a concept, so that's interesting just to think about, and like the NFT of course has an attempt to kind of halt the logic of the token from within it is also really interesting. Yeah, I mean, the question of new types for sure. I mean, I think that's what Gallagher, for example, is getting at in her reading of Dorothea becoming, like a recognizable type by the end, right? She's the type. She's a modern woman who can't be Saint Teresa. She's like she's a foundress of nothing. And if the book is sufficiently, resonant in its presentation, that becomes, a recognizable thing. You can then say she's a Dorothea. And of course, Eliot, as if she's kind of gets exactly how good the book is, she says that by the end. She's like, oh, so now we've got Dorothea, as if we know what that is. There's a kind of, QED at the end of this novel, right? Like, if you bought this, now you know what this kind of person is. But I mean, that has a really interesting relation to like narrative temporality, like because she sort of starts that way, saying, I'm going to show you this type. And then at the end, she's like, I showed you. Obviously, there's a kind of sense that the temporality is a little backward. Like, you have to kind of trust that there is going to be this type emerging. Bears an interesting relation to a question of like the Bostonians, where there is this social type, and clearly the readership is in various relations of recognition of who this person is, right? She is the lesbian. I mean, that is just like who Olive Chancellor is. She's unmarried by every implication of her being. She's unmarried the way Shelley was a romantic poet. So there's just something like, it's so invested in the sense of like, and that seems like he's taking an assist from the culture, that there's a recognition that this is a new type. So anyways, just to say that's an interesting question. I don't know if I have more to say about it. And the difference between 800. Yeah, I mean, I guess what I'm interested by is that that figure seems to. I'm interested when this like lyricism of number hits something that is supposed to be very similar. And I think one of the reasons Delany interests me is because, as a kind of speculative fiction writer and a theorist of that genre in relation to mundane fiction, as he calls realist fiction, and this kind of amazing provincialization of that. He's like, well, then there's books that operate according to the rules of our world, but that's just like a tiny part of literature. Most literature operates according to all these other crazy ideas. Is that it's always open, and that he thinks those genres are very good at, suspending the common sense about what is normal or what is realistic. And realism, of course, does that too. There are these great moments in realist novels where you don't totally know how crazy the world of it could get. There's one of for some reason I'm thinking of this moment in Emma when they're playing one of those acrostic games, and Harriet, in her dumbness, is like, it's a shark. She's guessing, it's like, it's a shark, and everyone's like, it's not a shark. Like, we're not, this is not that kind of world. There's no shark in Highbury, And it's like, she hasn't understood what the rules of the game are. But another possibility in that novel is that, toward the end, Emma's like, could it be that Knightley is going to marry Harriet? And she's like, no, it couldn't be. That's too weird for the world that I live in, right? But there's a moment where you can see the social change happening. Of course he could marry her, right? That could completely happen. It doesn't happen, but it's there as a possibility. And so I'm kind of interested by this moment with Vautrin in particular, where it's like, he just sounds like a romantic utterer of phrases until he says 47 over 60, and then you start to think this could be real. And so I guess it's just to rephrase your question. I don't know what the difference is, but it's a historically variable one that this genre seems really alert to the changing rules of that. How big is a priori ridiculous thing to think, and how big is it? How much is it possible to cognize? Seems one is a version of the question. But I don't know what the difference is between 2 and 3 lovers, like, per se, Yeah. No, but it's a great question. This is more the difference between like 5 and 50. It's an order of magnitude that I think the 19th century is basically, that order of magnitude is happening in all kinds of domains, and it's just everyone's talking about that as a new orientation toward quantity.
Yeah, my question, it connects. I have 2 questions. So one of them connects up to this question. I was thinking about, the way in which the individual or the single item, right, begins to conceive of itself in relation to a number that so exceeds anything that it can imagine, right, that it turns into, in some ways, the sublime, right? When that happens, and I'm trying to think of this in terms of, an earlier version of the city that's plotted by Poe in 1843, I think, with The Mystery of Marie Roget, right, where that turns on the notion of, I don't know if you remember that story, but it's basically about a cigarette saleswoman, I think, who goes missing, and then the plot of it's a nouvelle, is, would anybody have seen her? Does she stand out enough in this landscape for people first to notice her and then secondly to notice her absence? And can then it be tracked back? And you still have the sense that the container of this is small enough, is restricted enough that she would be known within this. And it seems that what you're pointing to is a sudden kind of radical expansion of this that also involves an expansion in some ways to include the world, right? That is the imagination, it doesn't sound like Madame Bovary in her room is thinking of herself and other French heroines, for instance, right? And when you bring Bernini into the question, there's a sudden massive expansion that goes beyond imaginings of the nation. So I'm kind of wondering how this connects to that kind of discourse, or a kind of practice of comparativism. And then on a very different front, I wanted to ask you about the language that you're using, the specific terms. So ecstasy, rapture, and specifically poetry and lyricism. You referred a few times to the rapturous poetry of numbers, the lyricism of numbers. So I'm wondering, I wanted to call your bluff on that. What is going on with poetry in that instance, or those instances?
Yeah, my bluff is always callable where poetry is concerned. So good one, good for you. Well, I think I just agree with you about that difference that you're proposing about from Poe. So that seems right to me, that it's a different scale question. And so much of seems like the energy of the century's fiction is about just inhabiting that phenomenology of how unlikely it would be to, for anything like that to be possible, right? And I mean, in someone like Dickens, you can kind of retain that, but often sort of at the cost of you have to have these incredibly marked characters. Like, oh, I saw that one because it was a fucking Dickens character, right? Like that person was acting in this way, as Raymond Williams talks about. That's this kind of urban seeing that needs to exaggerate things in order to even remember them or differentiate them. So that seems right. The question of scale is really interesting. I mean, questions of, and I haven't figured this out yet, but how this imagination, like where it stops, where it starts, what the boundaries are, national, political, racial, of course, like this isn't it's not, yeah, I mean, it seems important that it's not specified usually along those lines, right? Like Emma Bovary is not thinking I'm a French heroine, but she's also not thinking I'm like, a Guadalupan woman, right? There's a limitation, of course, in how big this gets. So it's not infinite, and it obviously is stratified in all kinds of ways. I haven't frankly thought much more about what to say about that, except it's true that there is a question though that interests me about how like the colonial periphery in the 19th century is so often figured as teeming, and that's often something we avert to talk about, the kind of phobic representation of that, and that seems right. But and we also know that that's how the East End is represented, or the underworld, or poverty. Those are contiguous spaces. It could be that the crossing the international or the kind of imperial line just means that the kind of erotic rapture that I'm talking about is not anymore on offer. Although even in something like Heart of Darkness, which is like, of course, the most phobic racist book you can imagine, there's like a lover on the other side of that for Kurtz, right? He's like actually supposedly with one of the women who's part of this teeming mass. So there's this sense that, and again, that's one of the reasons why I really want to insist on, I know it sounds like maybe especially with words like rapture and lyricism, that I think this is like good. And in many ways, I think in specific contexts, it is good, or at least non-phobic around certain things, but it obviously is not, it's not some pure progressive thing to think this way, right? It can be equally stratified or equally kind of mystifying about what's going on. That's also, I'm interested by the toggle between like perceiving that the world in general is big and that your specific subset of it has more density in social space or more extensivity in social space than you would have thought. And that's a kind of charged up excitement, which, if you're a white nationalist, can be very scary for me, but I'm sure is very exciting for them, right? I mean, that moment that Delany has in the baths, you could picture any number of political subjectivities having a similar feeling, right? When I finally went to the KKK rally and saw all the hoods, I was like, there's many of us, right? There's nothing neutral. It's a neutral thing. But it interests me that that feeling seems to me worth trying to figure out. Poetry, lyricism. Yeah. Mm-hmm. I know, and I noticed I was saying Vautrin like is above or below, and I couldn't really decide which one it is. I mean, sometimes I think those spaces meet. It's obviously a religious vocabulary, the ecstatic, and it's of course And so in some ways I think of this as a kind of secularization story, right? It's a horizontalizing of that language, right? That's what I think is happening with Dorothea, right? She's understanding in a way that doesn't coincide with her, like, okay, I can't have my vertical erotic relation to God or St. Teresa or to my convent founding or whatever she's supposed to be doing, according to George Eliot, or even to like, designing the fever hospital or the cottages that I want to do. I'm not going to get to do any of that, but I am going to get married. I don't think it contains that eroticism. And so I think the eroticism spills laterally out into this sense of like being part of a horizontal distribution of people, like being part of the secular world. So that ecstasy I think of almost in kind of like radiating outward, in a kind of redistribution of that vertical energy that I think is kind of inherent in ideas of ecstasy. It's also not exactly only pleasurable. So it's different than maybe a commodity pleasure. It verges on something much more, connected to pain, to suffering, to the passion. I mean, these aren't only good things or only pleasant things. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, those are great questions, and I have to figure them out. And I think they work differently in different parts of this argument. Some of the characters I think are sort of martyrs, and that's kind of what's going on, and some of them are differently related to that verticality. I mean, that's why the Vautrin characters and the whole series, the fictional series question does seem to me a way to try to have it both ways and to try to think about social extensivity. I mean, for that matter, I think this is an answer to some of the transnational question. I do think that it'd be interesting if you look at something like George Eliot or the multiplot novel in relation to these big continental projects, there's similar dynamics going on around like textual boundaries, around textual partitions. There's a couple of these things in Britain, but they're nowhere near like the ones in Spans. They're called Spain and France, two different places. Nothing like that. Like the Trollope novels are not like that. But I think that sense of, like in the multiplot novel, the sense that becomes a way to think, I think, in very similar terms to the way Balzac is doing about seriality, about what's next door. I mean, the famous thing, the thing for me that's really important here is like Lydgate and Dorothea, the sense that they should be in a romantic novel together in the same plot, but because of accidents of timing and of accidents of like disposition and type, in fact, she's not my type. That's not the style of woman Lydgate thinks to himself that I like, but they'd be perfect for each other. And if they were in the same plot, they could kind of just solve the book, But instead, the book has distributed them across these kind of in different places. And I think that's she's thinking very similarly in structural terms to what Balzac is doing around like, how do I get from this plot to that plot? It's like there's all this sense of adjacency being very intense, and there's a lot next door, even though she's doing it in the space of this small provincial city. That was a long answer, sorry.
So I secured the mic somehow. So a lot of what you just said, I think actually is a partial answer to what I'm going to ask, and it's related to what you just said. So I found myself kind of thinking about the relation between and the difference between the categorical and population and the pressure of numbers. Yeah. Right? So population and the pressure of numbers are one thing, and the categorical is another. And I think this actually also might have a relation to possibly, at least in these examples, but possibly even more generally, to a kind of relation between gender and sexuality. But one thing that strikes me about, the discussion of the Bostonians and also the discussion of Middlemarch is that there's this emphasis on the categorical, and that categorical has it's a type, but it's an invested type that has a kind of idealizing force, right? I mean, that's something to do with the verticality you're talking about. And it's asked, particularly, I mean, I haven't read the Bostonians in a long time, but particularly in Eliot, right? I mean, it's quite significant that the multiplying of Dorothea only takes place, I'm pretty sure, in the prologue and the epilogue, right? And so there's lots of different ways to read what's going on there, right? Even a little bit of anxiety about exemplarity, about this radical exemplarity of Dorothea. Why always Dorothea? Oh, well, there are many Dorotheas, so it doesn't matter. But I mean, there's different ways to read that kind of anxiety. But I guess what one question I just have is, I felt like there was, I would love to hear you, I felt like there's some slippage, but maybe it's just an economy between the categorical and population. So that's thing one. But also, it might have to do with the portions that you gave us, and I was trying to track it through the subheadings, and I can't remember the second subheading. What is the second subheading?
The like typological erotics, that thing, or that's the categorical.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Okay.
And it was.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's between 2 and 3.
Yeah.
Really.
Yeah.
I mean, I know there's crowds, when you're talking about Olive and everything, but there's also there's this emphasis on womanhood, femininity,
For sure.
right? And it just seems like a very invested, kind of content-laden type that has elements of the evaluative, right? The ideal.
Yeah.
And I don't quite, I'm just trying to figure out how that relates to the sociological and how that relates to population and statistics.
Let me take a stab at this. I mean, one thing, this is actually, you're getting at an organizational problem in the book, because I'm trying to figure this out. I mean, the way I want to do it is to have these 3 modes and have exemplary. I mean, the fact they're all happening in all the books, so which I kind of like, because it suggests to me that I'm not just making it up for a book. Like, of course, all the books are printed, so they all have this thing that I'm saying is in Persuasion. You can see happening in Persuasion, and they often shade into one another, these different modalities. And I sort of picking this part of James because of the weird fact that, in fact, both of them are in play, right? The books where he's trying to deal with population scale dynamics for the first time ever, or society-wide dynamics in these novels of the 80s, but they're also the books where he's fastened them onto this question of typology, as if that's like a route or there's an economy between them. There is an interesting, so this, to sidestep for a second to the question of the sort of gendered content of the, say, Dorothea thing, that's totally right. And there's 2 things that interest me about Olive, right? It's the fact that she is idealistic about women, but she's also just like attracted to them. And so there is that sense where that deflationary account becomes interesting if you stop thinking that her lesbianism is uninteresting or just pathological. You think it's actually a thing, and it represents a new social space instead of just a failure to be a good feminist or something, or a failure to be clear about what her feminist investments are. So that interests me about her. The other thing about Middlemarch is actually pretty interesting. It's true that there are other places where that generalizing occurs, and it's specifically, there's another moment that kind of occupies, I think it's chapter 17. It's when you're introduced to Lydgate. He is, of course, the other main character, and even the minor major characters, Fred and Mary, have a relation to kind of typicality and categoricalness and multiplicity that's pretty interesting too. But Lydgate in particular has a kind of inverse relation. Instead of having an ardent, desiring relation to some idea that can implicitly be remade into a kind of sense of communal participation, which you sort of sense is what's happening to Dorothea, that can be valorized or idealized. Lydgate, of course, has this sort of, Audrey Jaffe has read the whole book in terms of this particular anxiety, the anxiety of likeness anxiety, that I'm like other people, I'm tied according to I'm stamped and like a commodity, I'm just like everyone else. He has this total ambition to be different than everyone else. And in fact, it's most visible, his anxiety around that question is most visible when we get the backstory of his thing with the actress in France, Madame Laure, and he sees, when she says, "Oh, honey, I actually killed my husband on stage in front of you," he's like, the thought that comes through his mind is he saw her among the throng of common criminals. So it's not like she's a murderer. It's like she's just some regular lady. Like she's just like everyone else. She's just a murderer, a common criminal. It's a completely weird styling of that thing. But I think, in other words, that's a really gendered opposition to that. They relate to that question of typicality in a totally gendered way that's really interesting. And in some ways, I think there's just a feminine coloration to this entire project, in that sense of like the valorization of the passivity, the making of something, of being the commodity or in circulation. There's a kind of moralizing of it, but there's also just a sense of it being interesting, or the condition of everybody anyway. So the maleness is just an attempt to kind of hold back from it. Gender and sexuality, yeah, I mean, one of them, those are also maybe related in terms of fixity and fluidity or something. I mean, there might be some sense that economy might have to do with that as well, I mean, that interests me. I thought about it more in terms of gender and sexuality than I have in terms of these categories, but that seems right. I mean, in other words, like the categorical is like, you could think of it as, what Foucault calls like the frozen mask of the perversions. Like that's what a type is, right? It's just like this being in isolation. But what these books, I think, part of the economy that I think you're referring to would be to recognize that, but the nature of the perversion is to be in relation to people in specific ways, which is to be in relation to people of the same gender in a sexual way, to be in relation to them. And that I think these books, even the really homophobic ones, like James's book, know that, and so there's a possibility that this might not just be like, putting the lesbian on display, but actually being like, well, what kind of socialities does lesbianism entail? What kind of horizontal distribution would it have? What kind of space would it take up in the actual culture instead of just like staying at home and being the lesbian? I mean, there's a way in which that Lukácsian thing about the type reminds me of like what Foucault says about, it's like we know the passage about like the homosexual becomes a new type, but he's also talking about there being recognizable groups of people. So the type is never just like a person. And so there is that hinge between, even in categoricalness, there's a relation to bigness. Delany, for what it's worth, is obsessed with both kinds of enumeration. That's all he ever talks about constantly across every genre. He writes in like realism, pornography, literary theory, memoir, anything. He's constantly like, how many people are in the room? What relation did it have to the society at large? How big was the print run on this SF book? How many men's cocks did I suck yesterday? Like he's just constantly trying to figure out like how big anything is in relation to the world in general and how many kinds of people there are. He talks about this in terms of race all the time. He talks about this in terms of gender. I mean, just any category, he's constantly thinking, how many, are they enough to constitute a separate kind of node in the culture? And how big is it? So anyway, is there time for one more?
Is there another one? We have time for one more.
Thank you. I'm so glad you turned back to Delany because I actually have a question about this in relation to Delany and in particular in relation to Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, which I teach regularly. And one of the things that interests me about what you said is that while you're associating Delany with a kind of abstraction of multiplicity, one of the things that's really striking about Times Square Red is that or actually both of these parts of the essay, is that he's really, really interested in the specificity of every single, multiplying sexual encounter in this cruising space. And he wants to associate it with a certain version of the city, which he's associating kind of romantically with contact instead of networking. But I don't entirely see the abstraction in that. And so I'm kind of interested, since you've obviously been thinking about a lot of Delany in addition to the Delany that you picked for this, how this is, it seems like a very different account of the city than the kind of Baudelairean city in which you encounter this kind of abstract mass of kaleidoscopic sensations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, so that other essay I was talking about I'm talking about Eve Sedgwick, I'm talking about Joan Scott's essay on Delany, then I'm talking about Delany. And I was just telling Amanda over lunch, like I've been reading him, trying to kind of get through it all. There's so much. And this part of the essay just has gotten ginormous. And so I think in some ways I think it's super important what you're pointing to, that specificity thing in his work. I mean, he's very invested in that as well. I think it's really a both and often in that Scott essay and in some other places, he's often brought into, especially because he works in the speculative genres famously. So he's brought in to signify like that kind of untethering from the real, that awareness of the limitations of a realist view. And, people like Heather Love in her new book on the origins of queer theory have emphasized exactly that opposite thing that you're pointing to, his interest in specificity and concretion. And I think that's totally right. I mean, I think he really wants both, and he understands that both they're not opposed values, right? I mean, one of the most characteristic thing, aside from this numbers thing in his work, is like waylaying an interlocutor and saying like, no, you don't understand the life world that we're talking about here. And he does it most persistently around sex and around science fiction cultures. So he'll say, no, you don't understand how science fiction publishing works. There was no original edition of the Doubleday thing. That's not how, and he just sits, and his letters are just constantly, let me specify all the details that you need to know to abstract responsibly from this place. Similarly with sex, he's always like, here's what the space looks like. Here's who's in the space. But I don't think that effort is against the ability to abstract. I mean, even Times Square Red, Times Square Blue, of course, the second half, it's not about the Baudelairean city, although he's obsessed with the Baudelairean city, and specifically the Paterian city. I mean, he's written like books about Walter Pater. But that second half of the essay, I think it is an abstraction, right, from that data, not in the mode that I'm talking about, in that ecstatic mode. But I think he's interested in that. Can you theorize from that space? But yeah, in some ways, I think that book is kind of an outlier in his whole thing. It's kind of unusual. Because it's also maybe not an accident that it's the one that is most readable from outside any particular interest in science fiction or pornography or whatever. You can just read it as a book, which is a good book, but it's kind of unusual. But anyway, thank you.